Here's how I made a rabbit fur hat for my son. This hat is made from a single rabbit hide from a rabbit I raised, and I tanned the hide using tree bark. For this one I used willow and silver maple bark. That's a good combination, it makes a nice color, and it tans hides quickly. I have a whole YouTube Shorts playlist on that, so go check it out. I modeled the hat on this copper canister because I don't want video of my baby boy on the internet, and this canister is about the same circumference of his head. For all the measurements, I used a string to measure the circumference of his head, and then used half that length for each half of the hat. Here I'm just demonstrating how to get those measurements on my own head. I used a pencil to draw out the shape on the hide because those pencil marks would be a lot more faint than a pen. That way I wouldn't have to erase anything. And it's so faint you almost can't see it in the video. But here's essentially the shape I was going for. It ended up pointier than I meant it to because this was really experimental. I wanted to see if this sort of shape would work. So it left kind of a saggy bit on the top. In the future, what I'll do is more of a bomber cap style that has 6 panels that look like this. The design I did here was an attempt to reduce the amount of sewing I had to do, and while it doesn't look really great, it still worked, just ended up with a little extra material on top. I made sure my knife was razor sharp so I could cut through just the leather and not the fur. I still kind of made a mess with the fur, but having a sharp knife so you can just barely get through, that really helps make sure you're not cutting all the fur. Just barely cut into it. It's honestly a little risky cutting on a hard surface like this because it makes you way more likely to cut that fur. So here's our first panel. This will be one side, pretty much just a half circle, measured to half the circumference of his head wide, and about from the eyebrow ridge to the top of the head tall. Now here's my next mistake. I couldn't fit a little extra room for these panels on that hide. If I had the space on the hide, I would have added a 1/4 inch to each panel, just to allow room for the welt, which is the margin created from where you sew. So basically, I'm cutting out a long strip that I'll be able to sew in on either side to create a new margin. And here's where this pattern didn't really save me any sewing. I would have been better off just sticking with the classic bomber cap style. Luckily, this wasn't a very high value hide. This was a summer rabbit hide. The fur was a lot shorter and not as dense as my winter rabbit hides. So good to practice on. I'm going to be sewing this up using a thick hemp thread and a metal needle. Now, if you're a real badass, you can twine your own cordage from plants like dogbane or stinging nettle. Once I'm a little more confident with fur sewing, that's the route I'm going to go. Someday I want a full rabbit fur coat sewed up with natural fibers, and preferably a bone needle too. That long strip that I cut wasn't quite long enough, so I had to cut another little piece to sew onto it to increase the length. Here I'm just sewing that on. Basically, anytime you have 2 pieces of fur you're sewing together, you put the fur sides together and then sew it so the needle is going through the flesh side and then coming out the flesh side of the other piece. That ensures that the welt is on the inside if you're sewing something with the fur side out. And it will help that fur blend together more so you don't see that much of a seam. Now I'm sewing that fur strip onto our first panel. I'm doing a really basic running stitch, I think it's called. It's basically as simple as it gets. Again, with the fur sides touching each other, so the flesh side is out on either side. Here you can see the actual stitch. Just keep following that pattern. It goes by pretty quick. And with a good bark tan fur like this, it's plenty strong, even with a domestic rabbit hide. Wild rabbits here in America have thinner skin. I'd still recommend bark tanning them because that does toughen it up, but you'll have to do some experimenting. And here I'm finishing it off. I got to the end of the panel, and so what I do is I stitch it back on itself through the holes I already created, as you can see, so it basically fills the gaps between the stitches. And then I tied it off by slipping the needle underneath one of the loops, pulling it through, so it created a new loop, and then passing the needle through that new loop. It sounds complicated, but it's kind of intuitive. I'm basically just tying a simple overhand knot through the stitch I'm ending on. And that's just one of many ways you can finish it off. As you can see, the fur is relatively seamless on the outside, and that's exactly what I was hoping for. So now I start sewing it onto the second panel. I decided on either end of a stitch, I want it to be sewn back onto itself like we finished that last one. I left a tail at the beginning of the stitch. That way when I finish the length of the stitch, I can go back to the beginning, put the needle on that tail, and sew it back in, because that creates a really strong start and finish. So even if this design is a bad design, which I'm fully willing to admit, the sewing technique here works pretty well, and it's really beginner friendly. I figure if it holds up on a rabbit hide, it's going to work for anything stronger than that. Now we get our first glimpse of the hat. It's inside out right now. I hope that goes without saying. You can see those stitches. Now I turn it right side out. You can see it looks a bit like a mitten. And here's where I decided to make it a bit more like a bomber cap. So here I'm just cutting a couple slits down either side, and these will create ear flaps. You can see I pull any loose fur from the cut, just so it's not shedding fur on you when you wear it. And I decided I would fold the front inward so it'd have fur against the forehead, and I would just glue it in. On the front side, I tried glue to hold that panel inwards. I didn't really like it that much. I like using as traditional materials as I can when I can get away with it. So on the back panel, I tried just a couple of thread loops. I didn't want to run a whole stitch through that fur because it would make the fur look really matted on the outside. You would see the stitching. So just did a little loop on either side, basically to pin the corners to the back of the hat on the inside. One of the ear flaps was much longer than the other, so I trimmed it down here. Remove any loose fur. Once again, it can be really messy. And there we go. That's pretty much what the finished hat is going to look like. And to stretch it out just a little bit, I fit it over this canister, and there you can really see the floppy top on it. But that's our hat. It fits my boy. Next time I'll definitely use a different design. But this was a good way to shake off the rust, since I've not done any leather work in a long time, and to start getting used to sewing these rabbit hides. Since I raise rabbits for meat and fur, my family eats the meat all the time, but I've got a freezer full of fresh hides and a few tanned hides now, and I don't want those hides to go to waste. So I'm on a mission to figure out the best ways to use rabbit hides. As winter clothing, they're great because rabbit fur is extremely warm. Really young rabbit hides can be so thin that they just don't really work well on their own, so they're best backed by a piece of fabric or a thicker kind of leather. This hide I sewed this hat out of was pretty thick because I allowed the rabbit to get a little older. So if I can raise my rabbits older to have better furs, then I can just sew the furs as is without any sort of backing. So that's the hat. It was a great first project to start developing this skill. I'll be making a lot more clothing from rabbit hides because I have a surplus of them. So thanks for watching, and if you want to know how to tan rabbit hides, check out my playlist.